Welcome to Healing Not Heal, where we will talk about all things mental health and holistic wellness in a very transparent and culturally competent space. And I'm glad that I say that part in the end because, at one point I was like, girl, you should do something, put something on your face, do some makeup, do something with your hair. And I was just like, transparent space. This is how I show up for my clients. This is how I'm going to show up for you for the internet. Not doing all of that, maybe one day. So today I wanted to talk about forgiveness. And I feel like that's a very touchy and sensitive topic, but it's also a part of the healing journey, and how you may conceptualize that may be different and it may vary. Many would say that forgiveness is a part of the spiritual journey, right? You hear a lot about that in spirituality, and I would agree to a certain extent that forgiveness, the awareness and the intent behind forgiveness, is more important in itself than it is the act of forgiveness or saying I forgive someone. More so making it an individual choice of whether or not forgiveness is a valuable tool or a valuable process to go through or not. Making this decision may impact your spiritual journey, and depending upon how you conceptualize forgiveness is whether or not forgiveness is going to be beneficial for you and your healing journey. I spent a lot of time resenting people for how I felt I was treated, but I did so in secrecy. So much so that I was pushing down a lot of uncomfortable feelings and emotions to kind of rationalize why that relationship was important, despite how I felt I was being treated. I wanted to give people the humanity and grace of being imperfect because I know I'm imperfect. And so I would rationalize a lot of negativity in order to remain in those spaces. That was until one day, after all the hurt and pain, I had no one or no place to store these feelings of resentment except at my own feet, right? And that was taking accountability for allowing people to treat me that way in the first place. Once I became an adult, for not speaking up more, for not asserting my boundaries, for not being treated the way I felt I should have been treated. I had to own all of it because as an adult, I made adult decisions. I recognized that a lot of those habits and patterns came from a wounded child who didn't really know any better, learning and unlearning a lot of old philosophies that no longer supported my need for survival or served any purpose in my life anymore. I could no longer let that wounded child be the leader of my journey, of my adult journey. But it took a lot of intentional, and it still takes a lot of intentional, radical forgiveness with myself. When we end up in toxic cycles and as an adult, we can definitely root it back to a situation or event in our earlier years that contribute to the way that we adapt as an adult. That defense mechanism, that skill in order to survive a situation, that defense mechanism no longer served us purpose, and we were just doing it out of habit. We can most certainly hold people accountable who have treated us poorly or have caused us to react in such adverse ways. But where in the process do you hold space for your own forgiveness? So some people would say, I didn't hurt me, so why would I forgive me? I didn't do anything. Because how many times have you dishonored yourself to receive the love you could have given yourself? How many times have you said yes when you wanted to say no? How many times did you stay quiet to keep the peace? How many relationships have you self-sabotaged? How many relationships have you walked away from to avoid conflict? How many times have your actions not aligned with your values? How many times have you settled or become complacent with a man or a woman or a job, a friendship, a relationship? How many times have you betrayed your own intuition and judgment and took someone else's judgment over your own? Those who have experienced adverse childhood trauma may tend to betray themselves because they have not adapted to trusting their intuition and trusting their judgment because of the boundary violations they may have experienced as a child, where people or places or things that were meant to be safe conflicted with that thought. And so you begin to question yourself. You begin to doubt your judgment. And so you are more likely to portray yourself because you have not had a stable environment to trust yourself. And what I mean by that is when things don't make sense. For instance, if a parent, as you know it, are supposed to be loving, nurturing, supportive people and they're not, how do you expect or assume that other people do or do not care about you? How do you discern that? How do you trust that when people in your life that are supposed to be in that role don't, right? And so you may or may not form relationships with people out of that want or desire for connection or nurturing or protection or safety, and they're not really that, right? They might actually display some of those abusive behaviors you might have seen growing up through your parents or family members or etc. And so that is the topic of trauma reenactment, not trauma bonding. We could talk about that in another episode, but that is not typically, but that may happen as some people are underdeveloped. So think of it as that picture we've seen on social media where, you have the lanes and people are taking off for a race, and some people have obstacles and some people have like the barbed wire and some people have a brick wall to kind of get to the finish line. Kind of conceptualize trauma in that sense of like, not everybody is at the same starting point, and some people develop and learn some of these skills later on in life about establishing and developing healthy boundaries because they've never seen it before. They don't have a clear sense of self that separates them from their social environment. So then it hits you one day that you just want to live differently. You begin to explore yourself. You begin to explore that healing journey. And again, whatever sets that light bulb off or what sets that trigger off is different for everybody. And I think it is that forgiveness of self is the catalyst of exploring that healing journey and that connection with self and the evolution of moving forward. That's when the conversation of healing and forgiveness comes in, and we begin to ask ourselves, who exactly are we forgiving and what exactly are we forgiving, and how impactful is that forgiveness in my healing journey? So is forgiveness important? The short answer, yes and no. I stress the emphasis of forgiveness of self. So I feel like the forgiveness of self and the forgiveness of others are two separate journeys. Forgiveness of self, in my opinion, is the process that aids in true healing and progresses the journey in moving forward. Here's why. As I've said before, some of the patterns we've adopted over time no longer serve us. So at some point, we are doing more harm than good to our own selves. Whose responsibility is it to acknowledge that other than our own? I've talked about shame in previous episodes, and sometimes we lack accountability, self-accountability in the roles we played in certain relationships and played in our own suffering. I've talked about shame, and sometimes we lack self-accountability in our own suffering because that would mean that something would need to change. And as uncomfortable as that feels, it's easier if I can just be upset with someone else and blame someone else for their treatment of me, their lack of respect for me and my boundaries, their lack of honesty, their lack of integrity. I can blame them for those things. But if you never stop to ask yourself, what makes me feel like I deserve this level of treatment despite how I show up for this person? Am I creating a narrative of victimhood instead of leaning into a place of empowerment and honoring the fact that I know I deserve better? Are my insecurities driving this ship, or am I? What value does this person bring to my life? Or am I creating value in their potential? Am I creating value in their potential that I wish people saw in me? For a long time, I placed blame on other people about how I felt. So I realized that trigger is an awakening for me. I was unhappy with whatever that relationship dynamic was. I was resenting it, grieving in silence, crying in silence, being frustrated in silence, hoping that the person would change instead of changing myself. I had to look at the choices I was making and the people that I kept around me and my life decisions, my business and career. I had to assess relationships with family, friends. This is a quote that I tell my clients that my therapist at the time had told me when I start making radical change within my life and with my decisions and with myself. If they decide to never change, then what? It was that simple. You're crying about these issues and these concerns, and if they decide to never change, what do you do with that information? Radical acceptance hit me like a bitch. Because at the end of the day, I'm only responsible for myself. I can only control myself. If no one changes, that means I have to. And that's when I realized I needed to forgive myself for the decisions and for the consequences of those decisions that I decided to put myself through. That doesn't absolve other people, but it was taking ownership for my role. As a social worker, as a clinician, as someone who went into this field because you care about people, it was hard to take a step back from the world and be more self-centered. By nature, I want to help people. I want to solve problems. I want to give advice. I want to be helpful. I want to be, impactful, but at what expense? Because I'm no good to anyone if I'm harboring hate myself. So I had to learn to sit with myself, sit with my decision, and forgive myself for what I put myself through and allowed. That doesn't get anybody off the hook. Forgiveness was a tool for me to get me through my own journey, to move forward, to make better decisions. And then there's another layer of forgiveness. There's certain people that I can hold space for forgiveness because I know their personal experience. I know for me that hating them would do more harm than good. And I personally feel like God is working on the spirit of those people. So I don't even pay those people any mind. And then there's people that is just fuck you till forever. I'm okay with that too. I hold space where I don't have any malicious intent or poor or ill will towards anyone. They can just stay non-existent in my world. And I can live with that. And I can be okay with that. And it doesn't mean I hate anyone but they would just never receive the amount of grace and love that I've extended to them initially. And it's not a punishment. It's not meant to be one. It's simply saying that this person no longer holds value in my life in such a way that they hold up space or energy or effort. My nature is always cordial, kind, and respectful. I don't have to go out of my way to demean you, to hurt myself, to hurt you. And that level of forgiveness feels like no longer having access to me. And that's forgiveness to me, because back in the day, I would have just one of them. But forgiveness looks different for different people, especially within their own spiritual journeys. It can be spoken or unspoken, but it's at the level of comfort that you need in order to move forward. And it might be multiple journeys of forgiveness with yourself and with others. But I truly believe the relationship you have with yourself far outweighs any relationship you will ever have on this 4D world. So forgiving yourself is part of the journey and half of the battle. Forgive yourself for accepting less when you deserve more, for not trusting yourself or cheering yourself on, for doubting yourself or your capabilities. Forgive yourself for not showing up or practicing discipline or integrity. Forgive yourself for not having any boundaries and people pleasing. Have adult you. Look at little boy or girl you and apologize for not learning that sooner, but getting them there safely. Forgive yourself and do better. And when you mess up again, because you will, forgive yourself again. This radical forgiveness with yourself, because no one else deserves your forgiveness more than you. So I hope this was helpful. Like, share, subscribe. You can join me every Thursday. Of course, join me for Sound Healing Sundays on Instagram Live. Follow me on Instagram at Healing Crown Counseling. Follow me on Facebook, TikTok, all social media. And again, thank you, Healing Fam. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe.